In 1870, a mother's voice could vanish forever between breakfast and dinner, lost to scarlet fever or a carriage accident mere miles away. Her children waited unknowingly for news that crawled at horse speed through a world where silence meant isolation and distance equaled death. What if a grieving son's quest to preserve his deaf mother's fading connection to the world would accidentally give humanity the power to speak across continents in real time? Picture young Alexander Graham Bell at 3 years old, watching his mother cup her ear and lean closer, her world shrinking into silence. This moment would drive him to transform human communication forever. Feel the weight of his brother's deaths from tuberculosis, their voices stolen by disease in a house dedicated to perfecting speech. The family fled Scotland for Canada's cleaner air, carrying their grief across an ocean. Witness the night of March 10, 1876, when a spilled battery acid accident leads to 7 words. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." These words race through copper wire, shattering the prison of distance forever. Experience the vicious patent wars where competitors emerge like shadows, each claiming to be the telephone's true father. Alexander fights to protect his invention in courtrooms. That will determine who history remembers. Follow the explosion of telephone poles across America, transforming skylines into forests of connection. Operators, those unsung heroines with perfect diction, manually weave a nation's conversations through switchboards that hum with human stories. And discover the beautiful irony at the invention's heart. The man who gave the world perfect hearing across any distance chose to marry Mabel, a woman who would never hear the voices traveling through his wires. Their love story proves that the deepest connections transcend sound itself. From a Scottish boy's determination to keep his mother's world from shrinking, to the moment every human voice was freed to fly at light speed. This is how heartbreak over silence gave birth to our age of endless conversation. The year Alexander Graham Bell turned 3, his mother began to disappear. Not all at once, but piece by piece, sound by sound. In their Edinburgh home, young Alexander would watch Eliza Bell cup her hand behind her ear, leaning closer as he spoke, her face straining with concentration. The piano she once played with such grace began to sound different to her, notes blurring together like watercolors in rain. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, noticed how she turned her head at odd angles during conversations, how she smiled and nodded even when she hadn't heard the question. The diagnosis came like a thief in the night. Progressive deafness, incurable, inevitable. The Bell household transformed into something extraordinary in response. Where other families might have retreated into silence, the Bells pushed forward with fierce determination. Alexander's grandfather, also named Alexander, was Scotland's most renowned elocutionist, a man who believed the human voice held almost sacred power. He would gather young Alexander on his knee and demonstrate how each sound emerged from specific positions of tongue, lips, and throat. "Clear speech," he would say, his voice resonating through his chest where the boy's head rested, "is what separates us from the beasts. It is humanity's greatest gift." But how could this gift reach someone whose ears were closing like shutters against the world? Alexander Melville Bell refused to accept his wife's growing isolation. In his study, surrounded by anatomical drawings of throats and mouths, he began developing something unprecedented, a visual alphabet that could capture every possible human sound. He called it visible speech, and its symbols looked like hieroglyphics from another world, curves and lines that mapped the exact position needed to produce each phoneme. Young Alexander would watch his father work late into the night, oil lamps casting dancing shadows as he drew symbol after symbol, trying to build a bridge between the speaking world and the silent one his wife increasingly inhabited. The system worked, after a fashion. Eliza could look at these strange symbols and know how to shape her mouth, where to place her tongue, how to form sounds she could no longer hear. Alexander and his brothers would practice with her, their small hands on her throat to help her feel the vibrations, their faces close to hers so she could read their lips. It became their private language, a family bound together by the determination that Eliza would not drift away into complete silence. Then came the winter that changed everything. Tuberculosis arrived in Edinburgh like a plague from medieval times, and the Bell family was not spared. Alexander's younger brother Edward fell ill first, his cough echoing through the house like a death knell. The disease consumed him slowly, stealing his breath until there was nothing left. The family had barely begun to grieve when Melville, Alexander's older brother, began showing the same symptoms. The house that had once rung with experiments in sound now filled with the rattling breath of the dying. Alexander watched his brothers fade away, their voices growing weaker until they vanished entirely. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. In a family obsessed with preserving and perfecting human speech, death had rendered his brothers forever mute. His parents aged years and months, his mother's deafness now accompanied by a grief too deep for words, visible or otherwise. The doctors delivered their verdict with practiced sympathy. Edinburgh's damp climate was deadly for those with weak lungs. If the family wanted Alexander to survive, they needed to leave Scotland. The Atlantic crossing in 1870 felt like a funeral procession. The Bells stood at the ship's rail watching Scotland disappear into mist, carrying their grief like cargo too heavy to bear. They settled in Brantford, Ontario, where the air was supposedly cleaner, the opportunities fresher. But Alexander carried Edinburgh with him. The memory of his brother's fading voices, his mother's cupped ear, his father's desperate symbols trying to capture sound on paper. In this new world, Alexander found purpose. He began teaching his father's visible speech system to deaf children, and word of his methods reached Boston. In 1871, he opened the Boston School for Vocal Physiology and Mechanics of Speech. The name was clinical, but what happened inside those walls was anything but. Alexander poured his soul into his students, remembering his mother's struggle, his brother's silence. He developed new techniques, new ways of helping deaf children feel sound through vibration, see it through careful observation of lip movements and facial expressions. Among his students was a girl who would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Mabel Hubbard had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at age 5, but she carried herself with a grace that took Alexander's breath away. She was 16 when they met, 10 years his junior, with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Her speech, painstakingly maintained through years of practice, had a unique quality, careful and deliberate, like someone picking their way across stepping stones in a stream. Alexander fell in love gradually, then suddenly, then completely. But the irony cut deep. Here he was, dedicating his life to conquering deafness, falling in love with someone who inhabited the same silent world as his mother. When Mabel spoke, he heard not just her words, but the enormous effort behind them. When she watched his lips to understand him, he felt the barrier between them like a physical presence. He could teach her to speak more clearly, help her maintain the voice she'd fought so hard to preserve, but he couldn't give her what he wanted most, the ability to hear him say he loved her. Mabel's father, Gardner Green Hubbard, was a wealthy Boston attorney with interests in modern technology. He'd made a fortune in city utilities and had his fingers in various entrepreneurial ventures. One evening, after Alexander had finished teaching Mabel, Gardner pulled him aside. "Have you considered," he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp, "the possibilities of electricity?" The telegraph had transformed American business. Messages that once took weeks by horse now flashed across the continent in minutes. But Gardner had a vision beyond dots and dashes. "What if," he continued, "we could send actual sounds through those wires, not just signals, but voices?" The seed was planted, and it grew with frightening speed. Alexander's mind, already primed by a lifetime of studying sound and speech, began to race. He knew how sound worked. Vibrations in the air, waves of pressure that the ear translated into meaning. He understood electricity from his teaching work with acoustic devices. Could the two be married? Could human speech ride lightning through copper veins? His nights became consumed with the possibility. After teaching all day, he would retreat to his laboratory, a cluttered room filled with tuning forks, batteries, and electromagnets. He sketched design after design by candlelight, his desk becoming buried under papers covered with diagrams that looked like the fevered dreams of a madman. The harmonic telegraph, he called it, a device that could send multiple telegraph messages simultaneously by using different musical tones. But in his heart, he was chasing something bigger. If different tones could travel together, why not the complex harmonics of human speech? The scientific establishment was not kind. Established telegraph companies saw him as a threat or a fool. Academic colleagues whispered that he was wasting his talents, that teaching the deaf was noble work he was abandoning for fantasy. The mockery stung, but not as much as the growing distance between him and Mabel. She would visit his laboratory, running her fingers over his strange contraptions, feeling the vibrations of his tuning forks against her palm. But she could see the obsession in his eyes, the way he looked through her toward some invisible goal. "You're trying to give the world what I can never have," she told him one evening, her carefully modulated voice carrying a sadness that broke his heart. "Sometimes I wonder if you see me at all, or just another problem to be solved." The financial pressure mounted like water against a dam. His teaching provided modest income, but his experiments devoured money. Copper wire, batteries, custom-made components that had to be fashioned by hand. Gardner Hubbard's initial enthusiasm came with strings attached. He wanted results, patents, something to show for his investment. Alexander found himself juggling responsibilities like a circus performer, teaching by day, experimenting by night, courting Mabel in whatever moments remained. His laboratory became a reflection of his mind, chaotic, brilliant, teetering between breakthrough and breakdown. He experimented with membranes that vibrated like eardrums, with electromagnets that might capture those vibrations and recreate them elsewhere. He studied the human ear obsessively, even acquiring a cadaver's ear from a medical school to better understand its mechanics. His assistant, a young mechanic named Thomas Watson, would find him at all hours wild-eyed and muttering, surrounded by the detritus of failed experiments. The winter of 1875 was the darkest yet. Alexander's savings were nearly gone. His health suffered from too many sleepless nights. Mabel grew distant, their engagement strained by his absence and her growing fear that she was losing him to an impossible dream. His parents worried from afar, his mother's letters asking if he was eating enough, sleeping enough, remembering to live while chasing ways to transmit life. But something had changed in his understanding. All those failed experiments had taught him something crucial. The harmonic telegraph was thinking too small. Why separate different tones when the human voice was itself a symphony of frequencies? What if, instead of sending multiple simple signals, he could send one complex signal that preserved all the nuances of speech? On the eve of another attempt, Alexander stood in his laboratory, surrounded by the evidence of his obsession. His latest device sat on the table, a strange amalgamation of metal, wire, and an acidic solution that would vary the electrical resistance as sound waves struck a diaphragm. It was crude, unlikely, built from components that seemed to have no business creating miracles. Watson waited in the next room with the receiving apparatus. They had been here before, countless times, hope rising and falling like tides. But something felt different tonight. Alexander's understanding had crystallized into something pure and simple. Sound was vibration. Electricity could carry variation. If he could make electricity dance to the rhythm of speech, voices could ride the lightning to places no shout could ever reach. He adjusted the apparatus one final time, his hands steady despite years of disappointment. In the next room, Watson hunched over the receiver, waiting for another failure, or the first whisper of the impossible. Alexander took a breath, thinking of his mother's deafness, his brother's silence, Mabel's yearning to hear the world she moved through with such grace. Everything had led to this moment. All the grief, all the love, all the obsession crystallizing into a single attempt to make copper wire carry the one thing it had never carried before. The sound of a human voice, clear and true, defying distance itself. Alexander's hands trembled as he made the final adjustment to his apparatus. The metal diaphragm gleamed in the lamplight, stretched taut over its frame like the skin of a drum. Behind it, the electromagnet waited, coiled and ready. The dish of acidic solution sat perfectly still, a mirror of potential. 3 years of failure had led to this moment, March 10th, 1876, and the weight of it pressed against his chest like a physical thing. In the adjoining room, Thomas Watson bent over the receiving apparatus, his ear close to the cone, waiting for another disappointment, or the first whisper of the impossible. Alexander cleared his throat. The words he chose weren't poetry or proclamation. They were practical, urgent, born from a minor accident with battery acid on his clothes. "Mr. Watson," he spoke clearly into the transmitter, "come here. I want to see you." The The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then came the sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor, followed by footsteps. No, not footsteps. A thundering stampede as Watson burst through the door, his face alive with something between terror and joy. "Mr. Bell!" he gasped. "I heard every word clearly! Every word!" The two men stared at each other across the cluttered laboratory. Years of work, hundreds of failed experiments, thousands of dollars spent on copper wire and custom components. All of it had led to 7 words traveling through wire as easily as water through a pipe. Alexander sank into his chair, overwhelmed. He had done it. The human voice, that most intimate and immediate form of communication, had been freed from the prison of distance. But even in triumph, the irony cut deep. He thought of Mabel, of the way she watched his lips when he spoke, the careful attention she paid to every gesture and expression. He had given the world the gift of transmitted speech, while loving someone who would never hear it. The telephone could carry voices across miles, but it couldn't breach the silence that surrounded the woman he loved. Watson was still talking, exclaiming about the clarity, the potential, the sheer impossibility of what they'd achieved. Alexander nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to the battles he knew were coming. The patent wars erupted with the fury of a summer storm. Elisha Gray emerged from Chicago claiming he'd filed a caveat for a similar device the very same day Alexander filed his patent, February 14, 1876. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet there it was in black and white. Gray's design used a water transmitter, different in execution but similar in principle. Then came Daniel Drawbaugh from Pennsylvania, claiming he'd invented a telephone in 1867 but lacked the money to patent it. Antonio Mucci, an Italian immigrant, produced sketches from 1871 and accused Alexander of stealing his ideas. The legal battles turned vicious. Lawyers descended like vultures, picking apart every claim, every date, every witness. Alexander found himself in courtroom after courtroom, defending not just his patent, but his integrity. The Western Union Telegraph Company, seeing the telephone as a threat to their monopoly, backed Gray with their considerable resources. They hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who specialized in making inventors look like frauds or fools. Alexander's notebooks became evidence. His every sketch scrutinized. He testified for hours, explaining the evolution of his ideas, the progression from harmonic telegraph to telephone. The stress showed in his appearance. His hair grew wild, his clothes rumpled, dark circles permanent beneath his eyes. Mabel worried, her hands gentle on his face as she traced the new lines etched there by exhaustion and strain. The Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia loomed like a mountain to be climbed. This celebration of American progress would showcase the greatest innovations of the age. Alexander knew this was his chance to prove the telephone's worth beyond any courtroom. But the organizers had relegated his display to a corner of the education building, far from the main attractions. Who cared about a professor's odd contraption when there were massive steam engines and electric lights to marvel at? The June heat was oppressive as Alexander set up his equipment. The judges seemed bored, having already spent hours examining inventions. They were preparing to leave when a commotion arose. Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil had arrived, and protocol demanded the judges accompany him. The emperor, a lover of science, noticed Alexander's modest display. They had met before. The emperor had visited Alexander's school for the deaf in Boston. "Ah, Professor Bell," Dom Pedro exclaimed, "what have you brought to show us?" Alexander's demonstration began simply. He positioned the emperor at the receiver while he walked to the transmitter at the far end of the gallery. The judges followed reluctantly, their skepticism evident. Alexander began to speak into the transmitter, reciting Hamlet's soliloquy. At the receiver, Dom Pedro's eyes widened. The receiver fell from his hands as he exclaimed, "My God, it talks!" The judges rushed to experience it themselves. One by one, they listened in amazement as Alexander's voice traveled through the wire, clear and unmistakable. The telephone had announced itself to the world not with fanfare, but with Shakespeare's words carried on copper wings. The grand prize was theirs. But more importantly, the world had witnessed the impossible made real. Yet skeptics multiplied like weeds after rain. Newspapers dismissed the telephone as an interesting toy with no practical application. The telegraph was sufficient for business, they argued. Why would anyone need to transmit actual voices? Editorial writers mocked the idea of a world where telephones were common, painting absurd pictures of wives calling husbands at work, of social calls conducted through wires. One prominent scientist declared it idiotic to assume that any person would want to communicate by voice when they could send a telegram. Alexander pushed forward, driven by a perfectionist's need to improve every aspect of his invention. The first telephones were crude, their voices tinny and distant. He experimented with different diaphragm materials, iron, copper, even gold beater skin, the strength of magnets, the composition of solutions, the gauge of wire. Every variable demanded optimization. Watson would find him at 3 in the morning, testing minute variations, chasing perfect clarity. The carbon microphone became his obsession. He discovered that compressed carbon granules changed their electrical resistance in response to sound pressure. This meant even whispers could be amplified into clear signals. Night after night, he tested different carbon compounds, different compression levels, different configurations. Mabel would bring him food he forgot to eat, sitting quietly as he worked. Her presence a comfort even when words weren't exchanged. The first telephone networks emerged slowly, like frost spreading across a window. Boston got the first commercial exchange in 1877. 21 subscribers paid $20 a year for the privilege of connection. The operators, young women with clear voices and patient temperaments, manually connected calls by plugging wires into switchboards. Each connection was a small miracle, voices leaping across the city as easily as thoughts. But the system was fragile. Rain disrupted signals. Other electrical devices caused interference. The phones themselves were temperamental, requiring constant adjustment. Alexander spent his days racing between installations, fixing problems, soothing frustrated customers. The grand vision of universal communication seemed impossibly distant when he couldn't even guarantee a clear connection across Boston. Through it all, Mabel remained his anchor. She understood his drive better than anyone, perhaps because she knew what it meant to be cut off from easy communication. In the evenings, when exhaustion finally drove him home, she would make him demonstrate his latest improvements. Her hands on the telephone box, feeling the vibrations, her eyes reading his lips as he explained each innovation. She couldn't hear the voices that traveled through his wires, but she could see their effect on the world around her. "You're changing everything," she told him one night, her careful speech carrying the weight of prophecy. "People don't understand yet, but they will. Someday, no one will remember a world without telephones." Alexander pulled her close, feeling the familiar ache. He had given the world instant communication, while the woman he loved remained forever outside its reach. But Mabel's faith sustained him through the patent battles, through the skeptics and setbacks. She saw what others couldn't, that the telephone wasn't just about transmitting sound, it was about connecting human hearts across any distance, about making the world smaller and more intimate. The first long-distance call from Boston to Cambridge, a mere 2 miles, felt like reaching the moon. Alexander stood at one end, his voice carrying clearly to the receiver where a crowd of witnesses waited. Each successful connection pushed the boundaries further. 3 miles, then 5, then 10. The copper wires sang with human voices carrying business deals and love letters, emergencies and everyday conversations. The telephone exchanges grew like living things, their switchboards expanding to accommodate more connections. The operators became the unsung heroes of the new age, their fingers dancing across the boards, connecting lives with practiced efficiency. They knew their subscribers by voice, knew who called whom, became part of the invisible fabric binding communities together. Alexander watched his invention transform from laboratory curiosity to necessity. Hotels installed telephones to attract modern travelers. Businesses discovered they could close deals without leaving their offices. Doctors could be summoned in emergencies without sending runners through dark streets. The telephone wasn't just convenient, it was becoming indispensable. But success brought new challenges. The Bell Telephone Company, formed to manage the growing empire, demanded more of his time for demonstrations and improvements. Competitors sprouted like mushrooms, some legitimate, others pirates stealing his designs. The legal battles continued, draining money and energy. Alexander found himself becoming something he'd never wanted to be, a businessman instead of an inventor. Late at night, in the quiet of his laboratory, he would sometimes pick up a telephone and listen to the soft hum of the wire. This simple vibration contained infinite possibilities, every word that might be spoken, every connection that might be made. He thought of his mother, increasingly isolated by her deafness, and wished the telephone could somehow breach that barrier too. He thought of his brothers, silenced forever, and how the telephone gave permanence to fleeting words. The irony never left him. He had solved the problem of distance, but not of deafness. The telephone could carry a whisper across continents, but it couldn't reach the one person he most wanted to share it with. When he looked at Mabel, he saw both his greatest joy and his deepest failure. She would touch his face, reading his expression with the fluency of long practice, and remind him that not all communication required sound. As 1876 drew to a close, Alexander stood at the threshold of a transformed world. The telephone had evolved from impossible dream to working reality. Cities were being rewired for conversation. The human voice, freed from the constraints of geography, was beginning its journey toward ubiquity. But in his heart, Alexander knew this was just the beginning. The telephone would grow beyond his wildest imaginings, connecting not just cities but continents, not just voices but cultures. He adjusted the receiver one more time, listening to the faint electrical whisper that would soon become humanity's constant companion. Somewhere in that hum lay the future, a world where distance meant nothing, where voices could circle the globe in seconds, where no one need ever be truly alone. The telephone had been born from loss and love, from a family's struggle with silence and a young man's determination to bridge the unbridgeable. Now it belonged to the world, ready to carry every human story across wires that sang with infinite possibility. The diaphragm was nothing special to look at, a thin disc of iron no bigger than a pocket watch, stretched tight in its wooden frame. But when Alexander spoke into the cone that March evening, that simple metal membrane did something extraordinary. It shivered in perfect sympathy with his voice, each vibration pushing and pulling a magnet behind it, creating tiny electrical pulses that raced through copper wire like thoughts made tangible. The telephone's genius lay not in complexity, but in its elegant mimicry of nature. Just as the human eardrum translates sound waves into signals the brain can understand, Alexander's device converted voice into electricity and back again, preserving every nuance along the way. The breakthrough had come from understanding sound itself. Words weren't solid things, but patterns of pressure dancing through air. A spoken hello was really hundreds of tiny pushes and pulls, waves rising and falling in patterns unique as fingerprints. Alexander's years studying speech and deafness had taught him to see sound this way, not as mysterious force, but as mechanical motion that could be captured, transmitted, and recreated. The electromagnet behind the diaphragm was the key. As the membrane vibrated, it changed the magnetic field, inducing electrical currents that matched the sound waves exactly. These electrical twins of human speech could travel through wire at lightning speed, arriving at a distant receiver where the process reversed. Electricity becoming magnetism, magnetism moving metal, metal pushing air to recreate the original voice. But the first telephones whispered when they needed to shout. The electrical currents generated by voice alone were weak, like trying to fill a reservoir with morning dew. Alexander's next breakthrough came through carbon, simple compressed carbon granules that performed a peculiar magic. When sound waves pressed against them, their electrical resistance changed proportionally. Soft sounds created gentle pressure, allowing more current to flow. Loud sounds squeezed harder, restricting the flow. This carbon microphone became an amplifier powered by batteries, transforming whispers into signals strong enough to travel hundreds of miles. The carbon granules, packed between metal plates like black snow, gave the telephone its true voice. The first telephone exchanges appeared like flowers after rain, sprouting in Boston, New Haven, and New York. These weren't the automated systems of later years, but human-powered networks where operators, almost exclusively young women with clear voices and patient temperaments, manually connected every call. The switchboards resembled wooden honeycombs, each hexagonal hole representing a subscriber's line. When someone lifted their receiver, a small metal flag dropped on the board, alerting the operator. She would plug her headset into that line, ask, "Number, please?" and then physically connect the caller to their desired party using cloth-covered cords tipped with brass plugs. Each connection required human judgment, manual dexterity, and endless patience. The operators became the unsung architects of the new communication age. They memorized hundreds of subscribers by voice, knew who called whom, understood the urgent from the casual by tone alone. Their fingers danced across the boards like pianists, connecting business deals and birthday wishes, emergency calls and everyday gossip. They were therapists, information services, and social coordinators rolled into one. When fires broke out, they stayed at their post to coordinate rescue efforts. During floods and storms, they maintained connections that saved lives. The telephone network's nervous system ran through their capable hands. That first long-distance call from Boston to Cambridge seemed to violate natural law. How could a human voice, that most intimate and immediate form of expression, travel 2 miles instantly? Alexander stood at one end, speaking clearly into his improved transmitter while witnesses gathered at the Cambridge receiver. His words arrived not as faint echoes but as clear speech, as if he stood in the same room. The implications staggered everyone present. If 2 miles were possible, why not 20? Or 200? The copper wire had become a river that could carry voices to any shore. Technical challenges multiplied with each mile added to the network. Rain turned clear connections into static-filled nightmares as water seeped into junction boxes. Other electrical devices, telegraph lines, arc lights, even thunderstorms, created interference that garbled conversations. The physics of transmitting delicate voice patterns through primitive infrastructure demanded constant innovation. Signal strength decreased with distance according to precise mathematical laws. Electrical resistance accumulated like friction, weakening voices until they faded to nothing. Alexander attacked each problem methodically, developing repeaters that boosted signals, improving insulation to prevent interference, calculating optimal wire gauges for different distances. The telephone itself evolved through countless iterations, each addressing specific weaknesses. The original wooden boxes gave way to elegant instruments of polished walnut and brass. Crude receivers that required pressing against the ear became comfortable earpieces shaped to fit naturally. The transmitters grew more sensitive, able to capture subtle emotional nuances, the catch in a voice that signaled tears, the slight tremor that betrayed nervousness, the warmth that carried love across miles of wire. Alexander insisted on testing each improvement personally, spending hours in conversation with Watson, analyzing every aspect of transmission quality. His teaching background proved invaluable as he explained the telephone's principles to skeptical audiences. He would begin with the human ear, that marvel of natural engineering. Sound waves, he explained, strike the eardrum, causing it to vibrate. These vibrations travel through tiny bones to the inner ear, where they become electrical signals the brain interprets as sound. The telephone simply duplicated this process using metal and magnets instead of flesh and bone. The transmitter was an artificial mouth, the wire an extended nerve, the receiver a mechanical ear. This biological analogy helped people understand that the telephone wasn't mysterious magic, but practical application of natural principles. The Bell Telephone Company rose from Alexander's cluttered laboratory to become an industrial colossus. What began as a professor's obsession transformed into an empire of copper and ambition. Gardner Hubbard, Mabel's father, proved a shrewd businessman, recognizing that the telephone's true value lay not in selling instruments, but in controlling the network. They didn't just manufacture telephones, they built the entire infrastructure of modern communication. Telephone poles marched across landscapes like soldiers claiming territory for the future. Underground cables snaked beneath city streets. Switching stations appeared in every neighborhood, their batteries and switchboards humming with constant activity. International expansion began almost immediately. The telephone's universal appeal transcended language and culture. Everyone understood the desire to hear a loved one's voice across distance. London installed its first exchange in 1879. Paris followed months later. The The Atlantic Ocean posed a greater challenge than city streets, but plans were already forming for submarine cables that could carry voices between continents. Each new connection added nodes to a growing global network, synapses in a planetary nervous system that would eventually enfold the entire human race. Alexander's perfectionism drove continuous improvements in acoustic quality. He understood that the telephone's success depended not just on transmitting words, but on preserving the human elements of speech, tone, emotion, personality. His instruments achieved unprecedented clarity, allowing users to recognize familiar voices instantly, to catch the subtle inflections that distinguished sarcasm from sincerity, joy from sorrow. Business negotiations could proceed with confidence because participants could hear the hesitation that suggested doubt or the firmness that indicated final offers. Lovers, separated by distance, could share whispered intimacies, their words carrying the full weight of emotion across miles of wire. The telephone's reliability became legendary. Unlike the telegraph, which required trained operators and coded messages, anyone could use a telephone. Lift the receiver, speak naturally, and your voice would arrive at its destination with minimal delay or distortion. This consistency made the telephone indispensable for time-sensitive communication. Stock traders could react to market changes in real time. Doctors could consult on emergency cases without leaving their offices. Newspapers could gather information from multiple sources simultaneously. The telephone didn't just speed up existing processes, it enabled entirely new ways of conducting human affairs. By 1880, the transformation was undeniable. Cities that had resisted the telephone now begged for exchanges. Rural communities pooled resources to bring telephone lines to their towns. The device Alexander had struggled to perfect in his cramped laboratory had become civilization's new circulatory system, carrying the lifeblood of human connection through copper veins. But success brought unexpected consequences. The constant demands of business, the endless patent defenses, the pressure to improve and expand, all of it was pulling Alexander away from his first love, teaching the deaf and pursuing pure research. Late at night, in the quiet moments between obligations, he would hold one of his perfected telephones and marvel at the journey. From a boy watching his mother cup her ear to catch fading sounds, to a man who had given the world perfect hearing across any distance. The irony still pierced him. Mabel would never hear the voices that traveled so clearly through his wires. But she understood what he had achieved better than anyone. The telephone had made the world smaller, more intimate, more connected. No one need be isolated by distance anymore. In his private notebooks, Alexander sketched new ideas that pushed beyond the telephone. If sound could ride electrical currents, what about light? Could images be transmitted as voices were? He experimented with selenium cells that changed resistance with light exposure, dreaming of what he called a photophone. These investigations led nowhere immediately practical, but they revealed the restless nature of his mind. The telephone had been just the beginning. The principle of converting one form of energy to another for transmission could apply to any human sense, any type of information. The telephone exchanges grew more sophisticated by the month. Multiple operators worked in shifts to handle increasing call volumes. Submarine cables began carrying voices between cities separated by rivers and bays. Engineers developed switching systems that could route calls through multiple exchanges, creating paths for voices to travel from any point to any other point in the growing network. The human voice, freed from the prison of proximity, began its conquest of space. Alexander watched his invention mature with mixed emotions. Pride in what he'd accomplished warred with concern over what was being lost. The telephone made communication easier but also more impersonal. Business could be conducted without meeting face to face. Friendships could be maintained without physical presence. The very efficiency of the telephone threatened to reduce human interaction to mere information exchange. But then he would receive letters from families reunited by voice across vast distances, from businesses saved by instant communication, from lives literally saved by emergency calls. And he knew the good far outweighed any philosophical concerns. The carbon microphone underwent constant refinement. Different carbon compounds produced different acoustic qualities. The pressure on the granules affected sensitivity. The size and shape of the containing chamber influenced frequency response. Alexander tested hundreds of variations. seeking the perfect balance of clarity, sensitivity, and reliability. Each improvement was incremental, barely noticeable to casual users, but collectively they transformed the telephone from a scientific curiosity into an indispensable tool. Manufacturing scaled up to meet exploding demand. Factories produced thousands of telephone instruments monthly, each one tested to meet Alexander's exacting standards. Quality control became paramount. A single faulty connection could render an entire exchange unreliable. The wooden cases were crafted by skilled cabinet makers, the metal components machined to precise tolerances, the electrical elements assembled by workers trained in the new art of telecommunications. An entire industry had sprouted from Alexander's original prototype. The telephone's influence rippled through society in unexpected ways. Hotels advertised telephone service as a modern amenity. Restaurants took reservations by phone. Stores accepted orders without customers visiting in person. The pace of business accelerated as decisions that once required days of correspondence could be made in minutes. Social customs evolved to accommodate the new technology. Rules of telephone etiquette emerged: how to answer, how to speak clearly, how to end conversations gracefully. The phrase "hello," rarely used before the telephone, became the universal greeting because it carried well over early phone lines. Alexander's laboratory continued to produce innovations. He developed induction coils that balanced electrical characteristics for clearer transmission. He created acoustic dampeners that reduced echo and feedback. He experimented with different diaphragm materials, steel, aluminum, even silk, seeking the perfect combination of sensitivity and durability. Each advancement built upon previous discoveries, layers of understanding accumulating like sediment until the telephone became not just functional but elegant. The patent battles finally began to wind down as courts consistently upheld Alexander's claims. The fundamental principle, converting sound to electricity and back, was so clearly his innovation that competitors could only nibble at the edges, claiming improvements or variations, but never the core invention. Western Union, after years of legal warfare, finally capitulated and sold their telephone patents to Bell's company. The telephone's future was secure, its development now limited only by imagination and physics. As the 1880s dawned, Alexander stood at the pinnacle of success. The telephone had transformed from impossible dream to global reality. Cities hummed with telephone conversations. Businesses reorganized around instant communication. Families maintained connections across continents. The human voice had been liberated from the constraints of distance, free to travel wherever copper wire could reach. But in quiet moments, Alexander's thoughts returned to that Edinburgh home where his mother's deafness had first sparked his interest in sound and silence. The telephone had been born from loss, nurtured by love, and given to a world that would never again accept the isolation of distance. The future stretched before him, bright with possibility. The telephone was just the beginning. If voices could travel through wire, what else might follow? The principles he'd discovered, the conversion of energy from one form to another, the preservation of complex patterns through electrical analogy, could apply to any aspect of human experience. The age of electrical communication had begun, and Alexander Graham Bell had opened the door. But first, there was a wedding to plan. Mabel had waited long enough, patient through years of obsession and breakthrough. It was time to build a life beyond the laboratory, to apply his genius to the quieter challenge of domestic happiness. The world had its telephone. Now the inventor would discover what wonders awaited in the simpler communication of married life. Within a decade, telephone poles rose like forests across America, as cities rushed to install the infrastructure that would make instant communication as common as running water. The transformation was breathtaking in its speed and scope. Boston's skyline sprouted wooden sentinels, carrying bundles of wire that grew thicker by the month. New York's streets became canyons crossed by copper webs. Chicago rebuilt itself after the Great Fire, with telephone lines planned into every commercial district. The poles marched westward with the railroads, claiming the frontier for the age of electrical communication. By 1887, over 140,000 telephones connected American voices, each one a node in an expanding neural network that would soon encompass the globe. Business transformed overnight as merchants coordinated with suppliers in real time. Stock prices flashed between cities at light speed, and deals that once required weeks of correspondence closed in minutes. The old rhythm of commerce, letters sent, responses awaited, opportunities missed in the interim, gave way to immediate action. A wheat merchant in Chicago could check prices in New York, negotiate with farmers in Iowa, and arrange shipping to Europe all in a single morning. Department stores coordinated inventory between multiple locations. Banks verified funds instantly. The telephone didn't just speed up business, it fundamentally changed how business thought about time and distance. Markets that had operated in isolation now pulsed with the same information simultaneously, creating the first truly national economy. Emergency services revolutionized as fire departments, police, and doctors responded to crises with unprecedented speed, saving countless lives through the simple act of lifting a receiver and speaking. The Great Boston Fire of 1872 might have been contained if telephones had existed to coordinate firefighting efforts. Now, a single call could summon help from multiple stations. Doctors no longer arrived to find patients beyond saving. Families called at the first sign of serious illness. Police could coordinate pursuits across precinct boundaries. The telephone became a lifeline in the truest sense. Each emergency call a thread pulling help toward those who needed it most. Cities installed special emergency circuits that never failed, understanding that reliable communication could mean the difference between tragedy and rescue. Social customs evolved around the telephone as families developed new rituals of connection. Lovers conducted courtships across distances, and friendships maintained intimacy despite geographical separation. Sunday became the day for long-distance family calls, voices carrying love across states and time zones. Young couples discovered they could speak privately without chaperones, their conversations flowing with an intimacy impossible in parlors under watchful eyes. The telephone created a new social space, neither fully public nor completely private, where relationships could develop through voice alone. Etiquette books rushed to establish proper telephone manners. Should ladies answer their own phones? How long was too long for a social call? The questions seemed trivial, but they reflected society's struggle to integrate this new intimacy into established customs. The telephone operator emerged as a new profession, primarily employing young women who became the human switches connecting a nation's conversations. Their voices the first sound callers heard. These women, chosen for their clear diction and patient temperament, became the guardians of the growing network. They memorized hundreds of numbers, recognized regular callers by voice, and maintained the complex social protocols that early telephone use required. Their work was demanding, sitting for hours with heavy headsets, arms constantly reaching across switchboards, voices remaining pleasant despite difficult callers. Yet they took pride in their essential role. During disasters, operators stayed at their posts, sometimes working through the night to maintain vital connections. They were the unsung heroines of the communication age, their dedication keeping the human element alive in an increasingly mechanical system. Rural isolation crumbled as farmers connected to markets, small towns linked to cities, and the vast American landscape shrank to the size of a telephone network. Democracy strengthened by instant communication. The telephone brought particular transformation to agricultural communities. Farmers could check crop prices daily instead of accepting whatever local buyers offered. Rural doctors could consult with urban specialists about difficult cases. One-room schoolhouses could order supplies from city catalogs. The telephone poles marching across prairie and mountain became symbols of connection, each line a thread binding remote communities to the larger world. Political movements could organize across vast distances. News traveled as fast to farm kitchens as to city newspapers. The telephone democratized information, ensuring that geography no longer determined access to knowledge or opportunity. Alexander's personal life found peace as he married Mabel in 1877, their love story becoming legend. The man who gave the world perfect hearing, choosing to spend his life with someone who experienced sound through touch and vibration. Their wedding was small, intimate, a quiet celebration after years of waiting. Mabel wore white silk and carried orange blossoms, her face radiant with joy that needed no words. Their honeymoon to Niagara Falls held special meaning, Alexander could describe the roar of the water, while Mabel felt its power through the ground beneath their feet. They built a life rich in communication that transcended sound. Alexander learned to sign fluently. Mabel taught him to see the world through her eyes, where visual cues carried the emotional weight that others found in tone of voice. Their children grew up bilingual in speech and sign, equally comfortable in both worlds. The telephone's influence spread beyond communication as Alexander's acoustic research led to breakthroughs in hearing aids, sound recording, and technologies that would eventually help the deaf community he never stopped serving. His work on the audiometer allowed precise measurement of hearing loss for the first time. The photophone, though commercially unsuccessful, demonstrated principles that would later enable fiber optic communication. He experimented with sound recording on wax cylinders, contributing to the development of the phonograph. Each innovation grew from his deep understanding of sound's physical properties. Knowledge gained through years of helping deaf students feel and produce speech. The telephone had made him wealthy and famous, but his heart remained with those who couldn't hear its ring. He established research laboratories dedicated to deafness, funded schools, and never stopped believing that technology could bridge the gap between the hearing and deaf worlds. Legal victories cemented Alexander's legacy as courts consistently upheld his telephone patents, recognizing him as the true inventor despite hundreds of challenges from competitors claiming prior discovery. The Supreme Court's decision in 1888 was unanimous and final. Alexander Graham Bell was the telephone's legitimate inventor. The judgment examined every competing claim, every prior sketch and caveat, finding that while others had imagined speaking through wires, only Bell had achieved it. The victory was more than legal. It was moral vindication for a man whose integrity had been questioned for over a decade. He could have rested on these laurels, but success only drove him to work harder. The telephone patents would expire in 1893 and 1894, opening the field to competition. Before that happened, he was determined to push the technology as far as possible. International recognition flowed as governments and institutions honored Alexander's achievement. Understanding that the telephone represented humanity's greatest leap forward in communication since the invention of writing, Queen Victoria requested a private demonstration at Osborne House, marveling as Alexander's voice traveled from the Isle of Wight to London. The French Academy of Sciences awarded him their Volta Prize d'Or, 50,000 francs that he used to establish further acoustic research. Universities competed to grant him honorary degrees. But the recognition that touched him most came from organizations serving the deaf, who understood that his work with the telephone had always been rooted in his desire to help those who couldn't hear. The seeming contradiction, inventing a device for hearing while dedicating his life to the deaf, revealed the deeper truth of his mission: to ensure no one remained isolated by the barriers of communication. The telephone network became civilization's nervous system, as millions of conversations flowed simultaneously through copper arteries, creating an invisible web of human connection that spanned continents. By 1890, telephone cables snaked beneath city streets, crossed under rivers, and were beginning to stretch across oceans. Each conversation added to an endless stream of human connection: business deals and birthday wishes, emergencies and everyday gossip, all traveling at the speed of electricity. The network grew with organic complexity, each new connection increasing the value of every existing phone. Telephone directories appeared, growing from pamphlets to books as subscribers multiplied. The simple act of picking up a receiver and speaking had become so natural that people forgot the miracle it represented. Distance had been conquered so thoroughly that its defeat seemed inevitable in retrospect. Alexander's later years brought continued innovation as he explored wireless communication, optical transmission, and technologies that hinted at future breakthroughs. His restless mind never satisfied with past achievements. He experimented with selenium cells that could transmit sound using light beams, a precursor to fiber optics invented a century too early. His interest in flight led to early aircraft designs and founding principles of aeronautics. He investigated the possibility of storing sound magnetically, anticipating tape recording by decades. Each new interest grew from the same curiosity that had driven the telephone's creation: how to extend human capabilities through understanding of natural principles. His laboratories became playgrounds for the impossible, where failure was just another form of learning. The telephone had given Alexander wealth beyond imagining, but money interested him only as fuel for further research. He established laboratories in Washington and Nova Scotia, hiring brilliant minds to pursue questions that might not pay dividends for generations. His home became a salon where scientists, inventors, and thinkers gathered to share ideas. Mabel presided over these gatherings with grace, her lip-reading skills allowing her to follow multiple conversations, her insights often cutting to the heart of complex problems. Their partnership had deepened over the years, built on shared curiosity and mutual respect. She managed their finances, freeing him to pursue his research. He ensured she remained connected to the wider world despite her deafness. As the 19th century waned, Alexander could see the telephone's future stretching beyond his original vision. Automatic switching would soon replace human operators. Transcontinental cables would carry voices across oceans as easily as across cities. The principle he discovered, converting sound to electricity and back, would spawn technologies he could barely imagine. Radio waves would carry voices without wires. Television would add images to sound. Computers would eventually transform his analog invention into digital packets of information, but the essence would remain unchanged. Human beings reaching across distance to touch each other with words. The man who had given the world the telephone spent his final decades pursuing 1,000 interests. Each one approached with the same methodical passion that had carried him from an Edinburgh boy watching his mother's deafness to the inventor who conquered distance itself. He studied genetics, founded the National Geographic Society, and designed hydrofoil boats that set speed records. He worked with Helen Keller, helping her find her voice despite being both deaf and blind. He never stopped teaching, believing that knowledge shared was the only wealth worth accumulating. In quiet moments, Alexander would sometimes pick up one of his telephones, so improved from that first crude device, and marvel at what had grown from personal loss and love. His mother had died in 1897, having lived to see her son's invention transform the world. She never heard a telephone ring, but she had felt the vibrations of its success in every letter from distant family, every newspaper account of its spread, every visitor who came to pay homage to the mother of the telephone's inventor. The silence that had driven him to create had been transformed into a global chorus of connection. The telephone's true victory wasn't technical, but human. It had made the world smaller and more intimate, ensuring that no one need be alone unless they chose to be. Every call carried the echo of that first transmission. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." A cry for connection answered billions of times daily. The boy who had watched his mother retreat into deafness had given humanity perfect hearing across any distance. The teacher who had fallen in love with a deaf student had ensured that love could speak across continents. The inventor who had transformed sound into electricity had really transformed isolation into connection, silence into speech, distance into intimacy. As the new century dawned, Alexander Graham Bell could rest knowing he had changed the fundamental equation of human existence. Before the telephone, distance equaled isolation. After it, distance became merely a number, meaningless in the face of voices traveling at light speed through copper wire. The transformation was complete, irrevocable, and beautiful in its simplicity. The human voice, that most personal and immediate form of communication, had been freed from the prison of proximity. The world would never be the same. And it all began with a boy's love for his mother's fading voice, and his determination that no one should ever be beyond the reach of human connection. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that every phone call you've ever made carries the echo of Alexander Graham Bell's love for two women trapped in silence, his mother and his wife, whose deafness drove him to give humanity the gift of voices traveling at light speed, transforming loneliness into connection, distance into intimacy, and proving that our greatest inventions often spring from our deepest love. The boy who watched his mother cup her ear to catch fading sounds became the man who ensured no voice would ever be lost to distance again. From that first crackling transmission, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," To the billions of conversations flowing through fiber optic cables tonight, the telephone stands as a monument to one truth: that human connection transcends any barrier we place before it. Alexander gave the world perfect hearing across infinite distance, while choosing to spend his life with someone who would never hear his voice, teaching us that love speaks in frequencies beyond sound. So as your breathing slows and consciousness fades, let this thought carry you into peaceful rest. Somewhere in the gentle hum of technology that surrounds us lies the heartbeat of a Scottish boy's determination that his mother's world would never shrink smaller than his love could reach.